January 1943. The Stalingrad Kessel. The cold did not just enter the basement of the Univermag department store. It inhabited it. It was a living, malevolent presence that ignored the thick concrete walls and the pitiful kerosene lamps. It was a cold that reached past the skin and froze the marrow, a temperature so profound that the simple act of breathing felt like inhaling ground glass. In the subterranean depths of this ruined cathedral of commerce, General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, once the glittering spearhead of the Wehrmacht, now its sacrificial lamb, sat staring at a map. Paulus was a man built for maps. He was tall, fastidious, and possessed the meticulous mind of a superb staff officer. He understood logistics, timetables, and the geometry of war. He was comfortable in the sterile environment of high command, where divisions were neat red rectangles that moved according to mathematical probabilities. But the map in front of him now was a lie. It showed defensive lines that existed only as frozen foxholes filled with dead men. It showed supply depots that contained nothing but empty crates and stiffened horse corpses. It showed an army of 250,000 men, surrounded by nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers, trapped in a pocket, a kessel, a cauldron, that shrunk with every hour the Siberian wind blew. Paulus rubbed his eyes. He was suffering from chronic dysentery, and a nervous tic had developed under his left eye, a constant, humiliating flutter. He looked less like a Prussian conqueror and more like a haunted accountant watching his firm face bankruptcy. "The temperature dropped again last night, Herr General," said a voice from the shadows. It was Major General Arthur Schmidt, his chief of staff. Schmidt was everything Paulus was not: squat, aggressive, and a fanatical National Socialist. Where Paulus saw logistical nightmares, Schmidt saw only tests of willpower. Schmidt was the steel rod inserted into Paulus's wavering spine, the voice of the Führer inside the cauldron. "To what?" Paulus asked, his voice raspy. -35 degrees Celsius. The sentries at the tractor factory are freezing to death at their posts standing up. Paulus nodded numbly. He looked back at the map. The massive Soviet encirclement operation, codenamed Uranus, had snapped shut in November. For 2 months, they had been promised salvation. Hitler had commanded from his warm headquarters in Rassenburg, thousands of miles away. Fortress Stalingrad will hold. Field Marshal von Manstein will break you out. And they had believed. They had held. They had eaten their horses, then the leather of their belts. They had watched as Manstein's panzers fought their way toward the city in December. The sound of their guns a tantalizing thunder on the horizon. Every lancer in a frozen trench had looked west, praying to see the dust plumes of German tanks. But the thunder had faded. Manstein had been stopped 48 kilometers short. The relief effort had failed. The door was locked. "The supply reports for yesterday," Paulus said, changing the subject. Schmidt hesitated, a rare occurrence. 80 tons landed at Potomnik Airfield. Paulus closed his eyes. The Luftwaffe, led by the bloated egotist Hermann Göring, had promised Hitler they could supply the Sixth Army by air. They promised 500 tons a day, fuel, ammunition, bread. 80 tons, Paulus whispered. "We need 300 just to keep the men from starving. We need 500 to fight. The weather is abysmal, General. Junkers are crashing on takeoff. The Soviets have flak batteries ringing the approach corridors." Schmidt's tone was defensive, as if questioning the Luftwaffe was questioning the Reich itself. 80 tons is not logistics, Arthur," Paulus snapped, a rare flash of anger cutting through his exhaustion. "It is a slow execution." He stood up and walked to the corner of the basement bunker. The air smelled of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, kerosene, and the underlying, sickly sweet scent of gangrene drifting in from the overflow field hospitals. He remembered Christmas, just a few weeks prior, the Stalingrad Madonna, drawn by a doctor on the back of a Soviet map with charcoal. Light, life, love written in German. The men sang Silent Night in bunkers that shook with artillery fire. They had wept, thinking of home, still believing the lie that they would return. Now it was mid-January. The hope was gone. Only the fear remained, fear of the Russian captivity, fear of the Commissar's bullet, and, most paralyzing of all for Paulus, fear of disobeying Adolf Hitler. The field phone buzzed. Schmidt answered it, listened for a moment, and his face hardened into a granite mask. He hung up. That was General von Seydlitz. Paulus winced. Walther von Seydlitz-Gersbach, commander of the LI Corps, was the firebrand of the pocket. A proud Prussian aristocrat, he despised the Nazis and had been urging Paulus to disobey Hitler and order a breakout since November. What does he want? He says his northern sector is collapsing. The Russians have launched a massive armor attack near the heights. He says his men have no anti-tank shells left. They are fighting T-34s with Molotov cocktails and desperation.
Schmidt pauset.
He says he is going to order a retreat to the inner defensive ring, regardless of your orders. He cannot, Paulus whispered. The Führer's directive is clear. Not 1 foot of ground is to be voluntarily given up. Every position must be held to the last round. Seydlitz says his men are already at the last round. He says if they stay, they will be rolled over by noon. Schmidt looked at Paulus, his eyes challenging the commander. I told him that if he orders an unauthorized retreat, he will be subject to court-martial for cowardice in the face of the enemy. Paulus felt sick. He knew Seydlitz was right. Militarily, holding the outer perimeter was suicide. It stretched their meager forces too thin. Contracting the line was the only sane option. But sanity was treason in the Third Reich. Get me my coat, Paulus said suddenly. Schmidt looked surprised. General, I need to see. I need to go up. Paulus rarely left the headquarters. The reality of what his orders were doing to human beings was something he preferred to manage from a distance. But today, the oppressive weight of the maps was too much. He emerged from the Univermag basement into a scene from Dante's Ninth Circle of Hell. Red Square, once the heart of the city, was a cratered wasteland of rubble and ice. The skeleton of the city stood stark against a sky choking with gray smoke. The noise was deafening. A constant, grinding symphony of artillery duels, the screams of Stalin's organs, the Katyusha rockets, raining fire on German positions, and the rattling of small arms. Paulus and a small escort drove toward the northern sector in a staff car that skidded on frozen blood and oil. They passed columns of the walking dead. German soldiers, wrapped in rags, women's shawls, and stolen Soviet greatcoats, shuffled along like automatons. Their faces were gray, waxen masks, eyes sunken into skulls, staring at nothing. They saw a horse that had collapsed from exhaustion in the middle of the road. Before the animal had even stopped breathing, soldiers were upon it with knives, hacking off chunks of raw meat, their faces smeared with blood as they ate it right there in the snow. They passed a field hospital where the dead were stacked outside in piles 5 feet high, frozen stiff in the contorted poses of their final agony. There was no ground soft enough to bury them. Paulus sat in the car, staring straight ahead. He was the architect of this. He was the professional soldier who had followed orders into the abyss. They reached Seydlitz sector just as a Soviet artillery barrage lifted. The ground was black, churned earth. The stench of cordite and pulverized brick hung thick in the air. General von Seydlitz emerged from a command bunker. He looked furious, his uniform torn, his face unshaven for weeks. Look at this, Paulus! Seydlitz shouted over the din of battle, grabbing Paulus by the arm and pointing toward the front line, not 200 meters away. Look at what your obedience is doing. Through binoculars, Paulus saw the German line. It wasn't a line at all. It was clusters of frozen men in shallow pits. They had no heavy weapons. As he watched, a wave of Soviet infantry, clad in white winter camouflage, surged over a rise, supported by 3 T-34 tanks. The German machine guns opened up, but they were sluggish. The oil in the guns was freezing. The tanks rolled right over the foxholes, crushing the defenders beneath their treads. It was a slaughter. We must pull back, Seydlitz roared. We must condense the pocket, gather what armor we have left, and strike south toward Rostov. It is the only chance, Friedrich. A slim chance, but a chance to save 50,000 men. The Führer has forbidden a breakout, Paulus recited. his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. He says the steps are wide open. We would be slaughtered in the open without fuel. We are being slaughtered here. Seydlitz grabbed Paulus's lapels, shaking the army commander.
Hitler is insane.
He doesn't see this. He is moving imaginary divisions on a map in Prussia. You are the commander here. Your duty is to your men, not to a madman. Paulus pulled away, trembling. My oath, Walther. My oath to the Führer. Your oath is murdering your army. Paulus fled back to the staff car. The ride back to the Univermag was a blur of misery. He felt the crushing weight of 250,000 lives pressing down on his chest. He was a man drowning in paperwork and protocol while the real world burned around him. Back in the basement, the warmth was nauseating. Schmidt was waiting, looking disapproving of the excursion. The Soviets sent another ultimatum, Schmidt said dryly, tossing a paper onto the map table. It was the second one. The Soviet commanders Rokossovsky and Voronov offered honorable surrender terms. Officers could keep their sidearms. Rations would be provided. Medical care for the wounded. It is propaganda, Schmidt spat. They will shoot us all behind the chemical factory. Perhaps, Paulus murmured. He picked up the paper. The terms were generous. Surprisingly so. We must reject it immediately, General. It would be a sign of weakness. We must issue an order to the troops. Fight to the last cartridge. Paulus looked at Schmidt. He saw the fanaticism burning in the little man's eyes. Schmidt would happily die here, taking everyone with him, just to prove his loyalty to National Socialism. Yes, Paulus said weakly. Reject it. But that night, Paulus could not sleep. The dysentery racked his body, and guilt racked his mind. He kept seeing the faces of the men hacking at the dead horse. He kept seeing the T-34s rolling over the frozen foxholes. He realized that Seydlitz was right, and Schmidt was wrong, and Hitler was lying. There was no relief coming. The airlift was a fantasy. The fortress was a tomb. He sat up on his cot, shivering under a thin blanket. The truth was a cold, hard stone in his gut. The Sixth Army was doomed. The only question remained: how would it die? Would it die a slow, lingering death of starvation and freezing over the next few weeks, while Hitler pretended they were heroes? Or would they attempt one final, desperate act of military coherence? Paulus knew he was not a brave man like Rommel. He was not an independent thinker like Manstein. He was a creature of the system, but the system had failed. He needed to tell the truth. Not the truth filtered through Schmidt's fanaticism, or the Luftwaffe's lies, or the vagaries of daily reports. He needed to send a message to Adolf Hitler that was so stark, so undeniable, that it would force the dictator to face reality. He needed to demand freedom of action. He needed to demand permission to save what was left of his army, even if it meant defying the supreme commander. It was the most terrifying decision of his life, more terrifying than the Soviet tanks. It was an act of intellectual mutiny. He swung his legs out of the cot and walked over to his small desk. He turned up the kerosene lamp. He took a piece of paper and a pencil. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He began to draft the telegram. He wrote, crossed out, rewrote. He tried to balance the ingrained deference of a German officer with the screaming urgency of the disaster. He tried to use the language of the general staff to describe apocalypse. He wrote about the collapsing fronts. He wrote about the starvation rations. He wrote about the complete lack of fuel for armor. He wrote that the men were losing consciousness from the cold. Took him hours. The bunker grew quiet around him, save for the distant thumping of artillery. Finally, around 4 a.m. on January 24th, he finished. He looked at the paper. It was a death warrant, either for the Sixth Army or perhaps for himself. He summoned his signals officer. Send this, Paulus said, his voice flat. Top secret. Immediate. Direct to the Führer headquarters Wolfschanz. For the Führer's eyes only. The officer saluted and took the paper. Paulus watched him go, feeling a strange, terrifying lightness. The deed was done. The truth, the awful, frozen truth of Stalingrad, was winging its way through the ether toward Rassenberg. Now, all he could do was wait for the reply from the god he served. January 24, 1943. Rassenberg, East Prussia. The Wolf's Lair. The telegram arrived at the Führer headquarters not as a physical blow, but as a whisper in a room designed to silence the world. The Wolf's Lair was a complex of concrete bunkers, hidden deep in the Masurian woods. Here there was no starving, no freezing, no lice. There was tea, Danish pastries, and the low hum of ventilation fans. Adolf Hitler stood over the map table. His back was bent, his eyes magnified by reading glasses. General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff, held Paulus's message in his hand. Zeitzler was a bald, energetic man who had tried, in vain, to make Hitler see reason for months. He had even reduced his own rations to match the Stalingrad troops to prove a point, until Hitler ordered him to stop. "My Führer," Zeitzler said, his voice trembling slightly. "A message from General Paulus. It is grave." Hitler didn't look up from the map. He was moving a division that had ceased to exist 2 weeks ago. "Read it," Zeitzler began. He read Paulus's words about the collapse, the starvation, the frozen centuries, the impossibility of defense. He read the final, desperate plea for freedom of action, the code word for surrender or an unauthorized breakout attempt. When Zeitzler finished, the silence in the bunker was absolute. Hitler slowly straightened up. He took off his glasses. His blue eyes were watery, distant. He did not see the basement in the Univermag. He did not see the piles of corpses. He saw a test of will. To Hitler, Stalingrad was no longer a military objective. It was a spiritual symbol, the National Socialist will against the Slavic horde. "Paulus is tired," Hitler said softly. "He has lost his nerve. He is losing his army, my Führer." Zeitzler burst out. "They have nothing. No fuel, no food. If we do not allow them to surrender, we are sentencing 250,000 German men to death for nothing." Hitler's face hardened. The mask of the calm statesman slipped, revealing the fanatic beneath. "For nothing,"
Hitler snapped.
"They are tying down Soviet armies. They are buying time for the reconstruction of the Eastern Front. Their sacrifice is the foundation of our future victory." He snatched the telegram from Zeitzler's hand. He didn't look at it. He didn't read the lines about the suffering. He crumbled it into a ball and threw it onto the map table. "There will be no surrender," Hitler declared. "The Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man and the last round. By their heroic endurance, they will make an unforgettable contribution to the establishment of a defensive front and the salvation of the Western world." It was a sentence of death. But Hitler had one more card to play, a psychological card. He looked at the calendar. January 30th was approaching, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power. He needed a hero. He needed a Wagnerian tragedy, not a humiliating capitulation. "Paulus is worried about his own fate," Hitler mused. "We must help him make the right decision." "The right decision?" Zeitzler asked. "In the history of Prussia," Hitler said, a dark smile touching his lips, "no German field marshal has ever surrendered to the enemy." He turned to his adjutant. "Promote him," Hitler ordered. "Make Paulus a general field marshal. And promote Schmidt. Promote them all. Send the promotions by radio immediately." Zeitzler stared in horror. He understood the message perfectly. It wasn't a reward. It was a suicide order. By promoting Paulus to the highest rank in the army, Hitler was telling him, "A field marshal dies. He does not go into captivity. Here is your baton, use your pistol." January 31st, 1943. The Univermag basement. The radio message came through at dawn. The batteries were dying, the signal weak. Major General Arthur Schmidt took the headset off. His eyes were gleaming with a manic light. He walked over to the cot where Paulus lay, unshaven, filthy, racking with spasms of coughing. "General," Schmidt said, his voice trembling with pride. "The Führer, he has done it. He has promoted you to General Field Marshal." Paulus sat up slowly. He looked at Schmidt. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. The weight of the rank landed on his shoulders like a lead coffin. "It is not an honor, Arthur," Paulus whispered. "It is an invitation. Sir, don't you see?" Paulus's voice was bitter. "He wants a martyr. He wants me to shoot myself. He wants to proclaim to the world that the commander of the 6th Army died a hero's death on the ruins of Stalingrad, leading his men into Valhalla." Paulus stood up. He walked to the mirror. He looked at his reflection. He saw a broken man, a man who had followed orders until he had led his men into hell. He looked at his service pistol lying on the desk. For a moment he considered it. It would be easy. One pull of the trigger. The pain would stop. The guilt would stop. He would be immortalized in the Reich. But then, he heard a sound from the corridor. It was the sound of boots, Russian boots, and voices speaking a language that was not German. The end had come. The door to the office burst open. A young Soviet lieutenant, Fyodor Ilchenko, stepped in, submachine gun leveled. Behind him were soldiers with dirt-smeared faces, looking at the German officers with a mixture of hatred and curiosity. Schmidt stood at attention, puffing out his chest. "I am General Schmidt," he barked. "This is Field Marshal Paulus." The Soviet lieutenant blinked. He looked at the tall, gaunt man in the corner. "You are surrender?" the lieutenant asked in broken German. The room went silent. This was the moment, the choice between the myth and the man. Paulus looked at the pistol on the desk. He looked at the picture of Hitler on the wall. And then he looked at the young Russian boy holding the gun. For the first time in the war, Friedrich Paulus disobeyed Adolf Hitler. "I have no intention," Paulus said softly to Schmidt, "of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal." He turned to the Russian. He raised his hands slowly. "We surrender," Paulus said. February 1st, 1943. Rassenberg. The news hit the Wolf's Lair like a physical explosion. Hitler was eating soup when the report came in. He didn't finish the spoon. He stared at the wall, his face turning a terrifying shade of red. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. "He surrendered?"
Hitler whispered.
"He is alive?" "Yes, my Führer," Jodl said quietly. "The Russians are broadcasting it. They have him." Hitler stood up and swept the soup bowl off the table. It shattered against the wall, staining the map of Russia. The man should have shot himself just as the old commanders who threw themselves on their swords when they saw that the cause was lost. Hitler screamed, spittle flying from his lips. That is the only thing to do. Even a woman has the pride to lock herself in and shoot herself. But this man has no character. He paced the room, ranting, raving, a man betrayed not by the enemy, but by reality. "I make him a field marshal. I give him the highest honor, and he drags it into the mud. He will go to Moscow. He will sign papers. He will make speeches on the radio. He is a coward, a common coward." Hitler stopped. He looked at Zeitzler. "That is the last field marshal I will ever appoint in this war," Hitler swore. He was wrong, of course. There would be others, and they would surrender too. But the spell was broken. The myth of the Nazi Superman died in that basement. The long march. Outside Stalingrad, the guns finally fell silent. A strange, eerie quiet descended over the city. It was over. From the ruins, the survivors emerged. They didn't look like soldiers anymore. They looked like ghosts. 91,000 men. The remnants of the majestic 6th Army. They shuffled into columns. The Russians watched them. There was little cheering. The Russians were too tired, too cold, and too horrified by what they saw to cheer. Paulus was led to a Soviet staff car. He was driven away into captivity. He would survive the war. He would eventually testify against the Nazis at Nuremberg. He would live in East Germany, a ghost of a man, forever analyzing his maps, trying to find the moment where it all went wrong. But his men, they began the long march to Siberia. They walked through the snow, wrapped in rags. They died by the thousands on the road. Typhus, dysentery, starvation, grief. Of the 91,000 who surrendered in the ruins of Stalingrad, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Epilogue. The telegram. In the archives of history, the telegram Paulus sent on January 24th remains. It is a document of ultimate despair. But the most telling document is not the one Paulus wrote. It is the one he never received. The imaginary reply that Hitler constructed in his own mind, the belief that a title, a baton, and a myth were enough to stop a tank. Hitler refused to read the telegram because it contained a truth he could not survive, that he was mortal and that he was losing. In the end, the Bohemian corporal got his wish. The Sixth Army did die, but they didn't die for a strategic purpose or for the salvation of the West. They died for a lie on a map. And as the long line of prisoners vanished into the white horizon of the Russian steppe, the Third Reich began its own long, slow march into the grave. The end.